Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to provide remarks this morning at this vitally important gathering at a critical point in our collective nation's history. I want to thank right up front Peter for the leadership he provides CEPA and the foresight in establishing this organization 10 years ago. I'd also like to thank Minister Lychek, sir, for your thoughts. It's an honor for me and a little intimidating to be following you up here. A shout out to a former colleague and somebody I've always looked up to, Lieutenant General retired Ben Hodges, who's off to my left flank here, former U.S. Army Europe commander, not that long ago, the new Pershing chair here at CEPA. Ben, it was your foresight and your dogged efforts as the U.S. Army Europe commander that has the Army's posture in Europe much better today than it was 5 years ago. And of course, I want to thank you all for coming, the distinguished guests. I look at the guest list as I came here again, wonder why I'm sitting up here when I saw the credentials and everybody that's in this room here today. Very impressive. Now, I must admit that when being surprised when I received the offer last week to speak at this forum, the last time I served in Europe was as a lieutenant in the mid-1980s in what was then West Germany. In reviewing the attendance roster this morning, I realized that most of you here today would not have been welcome at a forum back when I was a lieutenant, back in the mid-'80s, as we were on other sides of the wall in the inter-German border. What a funny difference a couple of few decades make. Many, though, have forgotten the worst-case outcome of conflict in Europe back then. We trained at the tactical level for a nuclear war as a simple matter of course. It sounds as like catastrophic failure today. But back then, it was our doctrine. It was our operational concept to have a nuclear war. As a tank platoon leader in a tank company XO down as a lieutenant in a very low-level tactical unit, we were constantly in the field training. And each exercise would end with the initiation of a nuclear strike by the United States to stem the Soviet tide. What sounds so terrible today, I tell you that we in the field back then, we loved it. Because when the nuclear strike warning came, it meant we could get out of the field and go get a shower. Perhaps I didn't have the right perspective on things back then, but when you're down in a tank, that's kind of how you see life. Now, the U.S. Army's mission is to deploy, fight, and win our nation's wars by providing ready, prompt, and sustained land dominance by Army forces across the full spectrum of conflict as a part of the joint force. That's our mission statement, and that's what we focus on every day. Today, the U.S. Army has over 180,000 soldiers committed to supporting combatant commander requirements in more than 140 countries. 116,000 of those soldiers are deployed outside of the continental United States. The U.S. Army currently fills 50% of combatant commanders' force demand and 70% of the emerging requirements. This peacetime requirement, in addition to our responsibilities to be prepared for our operational plans that sit on the shelf, drives the U.S. Army to have a significant percentage of our operational forces trained and ready on a daily basis. This is both very expensive and also produces a lot of operational stress on our soldiers and their families. The Army has come a long way in the few years, though, in terms of readiness and modernization, and that's what I'd like to focus my comments here today for about the next 15 minutes or so, in terms of where we've been, where we are today, where I think we're going in the future. Just a few years ago, the Department of Defense's strategic guidance was much different than it is today. U.S. was primarily concerned with our operations in U.S. Central Command's area of responsibility, specifically the ongoing operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. At the time, this made a lot of sense, as we were in the midst of significant transitions in both of those operations. But underneath that focus of CENTCOM, in the CENTCOM area of responsibility, there was a below-the-radar shift taking place that brought great power competition into the open. Simultaneously, there was a downward pressure on the DoD budget that emerged due in large part to the passing of the Budget Control Act in 2011. This drove a reduction in Army force structure and end strength, forcing hard decisions to draw down forces across the globe, to include Europe. As a result of the focus in the CENTCOM area and the concurrent downswing in our budgets, the Army leadership prioritized near-term readiness of our operational forces to prepare for Iraq and Afghanistan requirements, while simultaneously reducing force structure and associated end strength to pay for that near-term readiness. We accepted little to no risk of our forces deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan, and we paid for that risk aversion by dialing down our personnel and also our capital accounts, modernization, our infrastructure, et cetera. The results of those decisions are not surprising. At a time when near-peer competitors were emerging in the Pacific and Europe with new high-end capability and concepts, and also acting outside of international rules and norms, the U.S. Army was in the midst of a modernization holiday as we focused on the near-term fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. Adjusting for inflation just a few years ago, the Army only had about half of the funding for modernization and equipping than it had 10 years before. Accordingly, we simply couldn't afford to invest in next generation capabilities for high-end conflict, as Russia and China were doing just that. Additionally, as I mentioned, we drew down forces in Europe. By 2015, the number of permanently stationed soldiers on the continent had dropped by 35% in relationship to 2012. Finally, in June of 2014, the U.S. announced the European Reassurance Initiative, which consisted of sustainment of persistent rotational forces to Europe, security assistance in countries threatened by Russia, and steps to increase responsiveness of U.S. forces to Central Europe. So that's where we've been, which most of all you in here are very familiar with. So looking where we are at today, it starts with the 2018 National Defense Strategy, directing the U.S. military to first restore military readiness as we build a more lethal joint force, and two, strengthening alliances and building new partnerships. Those are the two cornerstones. There's a third one about internal reform, but I'd like to focus on the two I just described. I take to heart a quote from Churchill, Winston Churchill, which I'm sure most of you knew, that says, "The only thing harder than fighting with allies is fighting without them." Simply put, our network of alliances and partnerships remain the backbone of global security. As outlined in the NDS, or the National Defense Strategy, today's global security environment is typified by the reemergence of long-term strategic competition between nations. Revisionist powers are using their position within the international order to disrupt the status quo in their favor. Specifically, Russia continues to destabilize European regional security and disregard international norms, the same norms that have largely preserved peace in Europe since 1945. In line with the NDS, and in light of the return to great power competition, the Army is now prioritizing readiness and modernization. And within modernization, we are ensuring that all we do contributes to increased lethality and our ability to fight and win against any adversary. To be clear, the Secretary of Defense has prioritized the long-term strategic competition with Russia and China in the National Defense Strategy, which requires the U.S. military to be modernized, trained, and ready for the possibility of high-end conflict. And while we will continue to ensure our forces deploying to the CENTCOM area of responsibility are resourced for success in that environment, the focus and priority of the U.S. Army has clearly shifted at the direction of the NDS. And these aren't just words. They're words supported by resources. The U.S. Army has realized a $23 billion increase in the Army's budget from what we had in 2017 to what we believe we're going to get here if the President signs what's on the table here maybe in the next week in 2019. That's an increase of nearly 19% in the Army's budget over those 2 years. Specifically, If you look at research, development, and acquisition in those 2 years, that's a $5.6 billion increase in what we call RDA, research, development, and acquisition, from 2017 to 2019, a 21% increase over those 2 years. The 2-year budget deal is a good start toward reversing the historical shortfalls I mentioned earlier in modernization funding. Most importantly, we appreciate the efforts of our Congress right now to pass the appropriations and authorization bills on time this year. You probably are tracking that the FY19 appropriation, it sits, I believe the House is supposed to vote on it here this week. The Senate passed it last week. If the House passes it, it will go to our president, and hopefully by 1 October, we will have an appropriation. That's the first time in 10 years, which is a significant improvement in how to operate inside the Pentagon and across what I know is the U.S. Army. Today, ERI has developed into the European Deterrence Initiative, or EDI, and making a significant impact. EDI is supporting EUCOM, U.S. European Command's requirements for the presence of an armored brigade combat team, a division headquarters element, and other enablers. Coupled that with combat aviation brigade rotations, integrated air and missile defense enhancements, ISR initiatives, and other capabilities, the increased in-theater presence of the U.S. Army across Eastern Europe has fundamentally improved our readiness and posture in Europe, and has sent an unambiguous signal of the U.S.'s commitment to peace and security in this vitally important region. Keep looking at General Hodges on my left flank. You should be up here briefing this, sir. A lot of this was thanks to you. Furthermore, EDI continues to enable the U.S. Army to significantly accelerate the modernization of our Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicle fleet. Our plan today is to establish a second pre-positioned Armored Brigade combat team set of equipment in Europe with the most modern tanks and fighting vehicles in the U.S. Army inventory, along with the newly fielded Armored Multi-Purpose Vehicle, or AMPV. So again, we're taking our best equipment that's coming off the assembly line and we're putting it pre-positioned in Europe to support deterrence and the effects we want to have in that region. And we also, the EDI is allowing us to begin to set the theater with preferred munitions. Something that might be an unusual term, but think smart weapons, that all the combatant commanders fight over. We are prioritizing and resetting Europe at this point with preferred munitions. So this is where we are today. So looking into the future. Strategic competition among nations will remain the norm for the foreseeable future. The United States seeks to strengthen our alliances and to seek new partnerships based on shared values and mutual interests. As mentioned, this is a critical pillar of the National Defense Strategy. As stated in that document, the NATO alliance of the free and sovereign states is one of our great advantages over our competitors, and the United States remains committed to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. The rapid pace of technological change, coupled with the speed of innovation we see in the world today, demand that the Army makes changes in the way we develop and deliver concepts and capabilities for our soldiers. Hence, the newly formed Army Futures Command, unveiled a month ago today, in Austin, Texas, and commanded by my predecessor, General Mike Murray. They will establish unity of command and effort by consolidating the modernization enterprise under a single roof. Although through Army Futures Command, the Army will improve modernization efforts and bring coherence to the process of creating a single organization that looks at the future. This realignment is not about creating a new headquarters structure, but rather streamlining of work to overcome the bureaucratic inertia and stovepiping found in the current Army construct. And it is surely bureaucratic and stovepipe today. With AFC in the lead, the Army is embracing new technologies such as quantum computing, high-energy lasers, directed energy weapons, hypersonics, and artificial intelligence. In addition to Army Futures Command and what it will do, the Army is updating multi-domain operations concept, moving from a concept based on the future environment to how the Army will actually fight in that environment. Something we need to guide and inform our modernization processes in the future. An update on that concept, I believe, will be out in the next month or so. In Europe, we will continue to optimize our force posture of land, air, maritime space, and cyberspace capabilities. We will continue to enhance the resiliency and redundancy of our infrastructure networks to enable reliable and flexible response options. We will also continue to improve cyberspace security and operations through joint defense activities with allies and partners. We also expect to coordinate our joint exercise program with NATO allies and partner nations to enhance high-end combat capabilities, promote interoperability, and sustain strategic success. I mentioned the 2-year budget deal we have now, but I have to note that 2 years will not be by themselves enough to reverse the trend that has occurred since the Budget Control Act was enacted. We need to continue to seek the resources to prioritize and to sustain progress. And keep in mind that in FY20, we may be back to the caps that are imposed under the BCA, so it's something we hope to avoid. Ultimately, as outlined in the Army vision and supported by the National Defense Strategy, the Army must be ready for peer competitor warfare by 2022, and we must modernize the force with difference-making capability in a high-end, near-peer conflict scenario by 2028. Those are the goal lines that we have established within the Army, and we are organizing the effort to attain those goals on time. So that's the way ahead. So to wrap this up, I'll recount a few seminal moments of those where were you when events that I'm familiar with. My parents always talk about when I was a baby when John F. Kennedy was shot. That's every American that's old enough to remember that, and if you recall that as a young person, you know where you were when that happened. My first that I recall was back when I was in West Germany, 28 January 1986, when the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up, when it was launched. I remember as I was on the steps of Bravo Company, 1st and 13th Armor Battalion in Illesheim, Germany, when Specialist Albee told me that happened. We were transfixed at the TV watching the replays of what happened that day. I'll jump ahead 15 years to 11 September 2001, 9/11. Again, I was at Fort Hood as a battalion commander out in the field with a friend of mine named Paul Funk, who commands our 3 Corps today. We were both battalion commanders out in the field when that terrible day happened. Well, in between that, there's another where were you when day for me, and I think a lot of Americans. That's 9 November 1989, the day the Berlin Wall came down, which marks the beginning of the Cold War, or the beginning of the end of the Cold War and the opening of Europe, Eastern Europe, to the free world. I was on a mini tank range as a company commander at Fort Hood, Texas, when Sergeant Wendeley, the tank commander, came in and told me what had happened on the radio. This is before iPhones and everything. We were out in the woods, and he told me what had happened. I remember that like it was yesterday. I was young and not well informed about world history. I thought the Cold War would go on forever, and I would have multiple tours back in West Germany as a part of my career on Freedom's Frontier. Thankfully, I was wrong. And the organizations like CEPA allow us to gather to ensure what has sprung on 9 November 1989 remain the status quo. General Marshall, arguably the most accomplished and respected flag officer in the history of the United States, said on the eve of World War II, "Years ago, we had the time to prepare and no resources. Today, we have the resources, but no time." We are at a good point right now in the U.S. Army because we actually have both. We have the time and the resources. So the time is now to act wisely. In closing, I'd like to emphasize that the U.S. and Europe are bound by shared values: democracy, rule of law, human rights, liberty, and economic opportunity. And I trust that we will remain steadfast partners as we face the threats to democracy and freedom everywhere. So again, thank you, Peter, Minister, for leading me off here, and also thanks to Colonel Ray Wojcik for your support here today. I look forward to maybe seeing you at tonight's dinner. Thank you.